The look on my son's face when he walked through that door, I've replayed it 100 times since. He came in the way he always does, like a man who's already decided how the conversation is going to go. Shoulders back, briefcase in one hand. His wife Claire 2 steps behind him, already scanning the room the way she always does, pricing things in her head without knowing she's doing it. Then he stopped, right there in the middle of my living room. Because sitting in the wingback chair next to my couch, holding a mug of my coffee like she'd been there all morning, was Patricia Owens. Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "Dad," he finally managed. His voice had dropped about an octave. "What is she doing here?" Patricia looked up at him with the kind of calm that only comes from having nothing to hide. She didn't answer. She just smiled and took another sip of coffee. I picked up my own mug from the end table. "Good to see you too, son." He didn't say anything to that either. Claire had gone completely still behind him, and standing there in my living room on a gray November afternoon, my son looked more rattled than I'd seen him since the night his basement flooded back in 2019. Funny. 3 months earlier, I would have given almost anything just to get him to return a phone call. My name is Ray Kowalski. I'm 71 years old. I spent 38 years teaching high school history in Greenville, South Carolina, and for the last 12 of those years, I also served as department chair. Nothing glamorous. No stock portfolio, no investment property, no beach house. Just a pension, a modest savings account, and a 3-bedroom ranch house on Sycamore Lane that I've owned since 1989. My wife Joanne passed away 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. If you've lost someone that fast, you already know there's no way to describe it. One season, she was planting tomatoes in the backyard garden. The next, I was figuring out how to cook for one. I have 2 children. Daniel is 44. He lives about 35 minutes away in a newer development called The Reserves at Maplewood, which is the kind of name that sounds expensive because it is. He works in commercial lending. His wife Claire teaches yoga on weekdays and manages what she calls her personal brand the rest of the time. My daughter Renee is 40, lives in Portland, Oregon, and calls me every Sunday without fail. She teaches 3rd grade. She has never once asked me about my finances. Daniel and I were close when he was younger. Maybe not talk every day close, but the real kind. He'd come by on Saturday mornings sometimes. We'd watch whatever game was on and argue about history, which he pretended not to care about and clearly did. After Joanne died, he came around more for a while, then less. Then the visits sort of evaporated into text messages. Then the text messages thinned out too. I told myself it was life. He had 2 kids of his own, mortgage, career pressure. I understood all of that. What I didn't understand at first was the questions. They started maybe 18 months ago. Small things, conversational, almost easy to miss. "You still doing your own taxes, Dad? You think about moving somewhere smaller? You ever get confused about which bills are on autopay?" Questions that, one at a time, sounded like a son being thoughtful. Together, they sounded like something else. I just couldn't name what that something else was. Not yet. The call that changed things came from a woman named Sandra Pruitt. Sandra's husband, Gene, worked with me in the history department for nearly 2 decades. Gene passed away 4 years ago, and Sandra and I had stayed loosely in touch the way you do with people who shared a long chapter of your life. She called me on a Thursday afternoon in late September. After we talked about Gene's old students and the price of groceries, she got quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ray, I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. Daniel called me last week." I set down my fork. "About what?" "He was asking about you." Another pause. "He said he was worried, that you'd been having some trouble keeping things straight, that you'd missed some appointments and gotten confused about some financial matters." I sat with that for a second. "Sandra," I said slowly, "I haven't missed a single appointment this year." She exhaled. "That's what I figured. I'm sorry to be the one telling you this. I just thought you should know." That conversation didn't make me angry right away. Mostly it made me sad, then confused. Then I sat at my kitchen table for a long time staring at the pepper shaker, turning it over in my hands, trying to figure out what exactly my son thought he was building. About 2 weeks later, Daniel called. His voice was warm in that particular way it gets when he wants something. He said he'd been thinking about me a lot, said he was worried I was managing too much on my own. Said he thought it might be a good idea to sit down together and look at some documents, just routine planning stuff, nothing serious, something every family should have in place. He mentioned he'd been talking to someone, an attorney. I said that sounded fine. I hung up the phone and I called Patricia Owens. Patricia and I go back almost 35 years. We were colleagues, she taught English, I taught history, and for about a decade our classrooms were directly across the hall from each other. After her husband passed, and after Joanne got sick, we leaned on each other the way people do when grief arrives at roughly the same time, and there's no manual for how to handle it. Patricia retired 3 years before I did and moved to Asheville, North Carolina to be closer to her sister. We talked a few times a year, Christmas cards, the occasional birthday call, the kind of friendship that doesn't need constant maintenance to stay real. When I called her that October evening, I didn't know exactly what I was going to say. I started by telling her about Sandra's call, then about Daniel's pattern of questions, then about the attorney. She listened through all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Ray, how long have you been making excuses for this?" I didn't have a good answer. "Do you want me to come down?" she asked. I thought about saying no. I thought about telling her I could handle it myself. Then I thought about that pepper shaker and how long I'd sat there turning it over. "Yeah," I said. "I think I do." Patricia arrived 2 weeks later with a carry-on bag and a yellow legal pad, and the same no-nonsense expression she used to wear when she caught students trying to pass off Wikipedia as a primary source. The first thing she did when she sat down at my kitchen table was uncap her pen and say, "All right, walk me through everything and don't leave anything out." We spent 3 days going through it, my accounts, my documents, my pension paperwork. My mortgage statement paid off in 2017, thank God. My will, which was last updated in 2018 and was relatively simple. My power of attorney documents, which named Joanne as my primary agent and hadn't been revised since she died. That last part made Patricia look up at me over her glasses. "Ray, your current POA names someone who has been deceased for 6 years. I knew that. I'd meant to update it. I kept meaning to update it. The problem with grief is that it makes you allergic to paperwork that reminds you of who you lost. That means," Patricia said carefully, "that right now, if someone petitioned a court claiming you were incapacitated, there's no clear agent on record to contest it." I looked at her. "That's not a small gap," she said. We kept digging. At some point, Patricia called an old friend of hers from Asheville, a retired paralegal named Margaret, just to run some questions by her. Margaret confirmed what Patricia was starting to suspect. The way Daniel's questions had been framed as Sandra memory trouble, missed appointments, confusion about finances. Those weren't the worried ramblings of a concerned son. Those were the building blocks of a legal argument, a guardianship petition. Margaret explained it plainly. If someone can establish through testimony that an older adult is unable to manage their own affairs, even through secondhand accounts, even through exaggerated or fabricated ones, a court can appoint a guardian to make decisions on that person's behalf. Financial decisions, housing decisions, all of it. I sat at my kitchen table listening to this while the coffee went cold in front of me. "How common is this?" I asked. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "More common than most people know, and it almost always comes from family." That night, I barely slept. I lay in the dark thinking about Daniel at age 9, sitting at this same kitchen table, doing long division homework while Joanne helped him, and I pretended to grade papers and actually just watched them. I thought about his college graduation, the way he'd shaken my hand like a grown man and then immediately hugged me like a kid. I thought about the two of us arguing in a good-natured way about whether the New Deal worked and whether the South would ever fully reckon with Reconstruction. I thought about all of that, and I still almost talked myself into believing there was an innocent explanation. Almost. 3 days before Daniel was scheduled to come over, Patricia made a call. She reached out to an elder law attorney named James Whitfield, whose name Margaret had given her. Patricia explained the situation. Whitfield asked to see the documents Daniel was supposedly bringing. Patricia told him we didn't have them yet. He said, "That's all right, bring him in after. Don't sign anything until I've looked at it." In the meantime, Whitfield gave me 2 pieces of advice I want every person reading this to hear. First, get your power of attorney updated immediately and name someone you trust completely, not a family member with potential financial interest in your estate. Second, put it in writing somewhere that you have sought independent legal counsel. Because the moment a record exists showing you took deliberate, informed action on your own behalf, the narrative that you're confused or incapable becomes a lot harder to sustain. I spent the next 2 days with James Whitfield's office. I updated my POA, naming Patricia as my agent with Renee as the secondary. I also had a brief consultation with a financial planner Whitfield recommended, a woman named Carol Hines, who spent an hour walking me through the structure of an irrevocable trust and what it would mean for my estate. I didn't make any final decisions yet, but I started understanding what my options were. On the morning Daniel was supposed to arrive, I made a full pot of coffee. I put out 2 mugs on the coffee table. Then I called Patricia and said, "You still good to be here at 1?" "Already in the car," she said. Daniel arrived at 1:15. Claire was with him. So was a man he introduced as Stephen Garrett, an estate planning attorney from a firm downtown. Stephen was polite, careful. He had one of those faces that's been trained to look neutral. The moment Daniel saw Patricia in my living room, something shifted behind his eyes. "Patricia," he said. His voice was even but tight, the way it gets when he's trying not to show that something has caught him off guard. "Hello, Daniel," she smiled. "It's been a long time." Claire said nothing. She was staring at Patricia the way you stare at something that complicates a plan you thought was settled. I invited them all to sit down. Stephen placed a thin folder on the coffee table. Daniel kept his eyes moving to Patricia, to me, to the folder, back to Patricia. After a few minutes of the kind of small talk that doesn't fool anybody, Daniel said, "Dad, we really just want to make sure you're protected." "I appreciate that," I said. "Stephen has drawn up some documents that would give us the ability to step in if things ever got complicated. For your sake." I nodded slowly. "What kind of things?" Daniel looked at Stephen, who said, in the smoothest voice I've heard outside of a car dealership, "Simply situations where managing your finances might become difficult. We'd have the ability to assist with accounts, property decisions, investments, all in your best interest, of course." Patricia had been quiet through all of this. Now she said pleasantly, "Who determines when those conditions are met?" Stephen paused. "The documents," she continued. "Who decides when quote-unquote difficulty has occurred?" Another pause. "The designated agent would make that assessment." "And the designated agent is Daniel?" "That's correct." Patricia picked up her coffee and nodded slowly, the way she used to nod at a student who had just revealed, without realizing it, that they hadn't actually done the reading. "I told Stephen I wasn't going to sign anything that day. I told him I wanted to review the documents thoroughly with my own counsel." I watched his face stay very carefully neutral. I watched Daniel's jaw tighten. "Dad," Daniel said, "we're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help." I looked at my son. I'd known that face for 44 years. Right now, it was doing something it used to do when he was a teenager and had already decided how something was going to go and couldn't understand why the world wasn't cooperating. "I know you are," I said. They left about 20 minutes later. Stephen gathered his folder. Claire smiled at nothing in particular. Daniel hugged me at the door quickly, the same way you'd hug someone you were still hoping to convince. When their car pulled out of the driveway, Patricia stood up and brought both mugs to the kitchen. "Well," she said from the sink. "I know," I said. "He genuinely believes you don't understand what you just refused to sign." I sat down at the kitchen table. That's the part that keeps getting me. The hardest part of the next few weeks wasn't talking to attorneys. It wasn't the paperwork, though there was plenty of it. It wasn't even updating 12 years of estate documents that I'd been putting off since Joanne died. It was driving past Daniel's neighborhood on my way to the grocery store one afternoon and slowing down without meaning to. Sitting there at the light, looking at the entrance sign for the reserves at Maplewood and thinking about how much of my life I'd put into that kid. Baseball practice 4 nights a week for 6 years. College application essays I proofread at midnight. The down payment on his first apartment that he paid back and I never asked for. I thought about all of that, and I still kept going to James Whitfield's office. Because here's what Patricia and I had found, with some help from a financial advisor and a mutual acquaintance who knew a few people in commercial lending. Daniel's firm had not had a good 2 years. There had been a restructuring. His position had been adjusted politely, the way positions in finance get adjusted when numbers stop working. On top of that, the reserves at Maplewood is a beautiful neighborhood, and beautiful neighborhoods come with payments. There was also a home equity loan, a second one, it turned out. In Claire's business, the personal brand, had required some investment that hadn't returned what was hoped. None of this was criminal. None of it was even particularly unusual. People get in over their heads. It happens to smart people who make reasonable decisions that compound in the wrong direction. But when you're drowning in quiet and the person nearest to you has a pension and a paid-off house and money put away, something in your thinking can shift. You stop seeing a father. You start seeing a solution. I sat in James Whitfield's office on a Wednesday morning with all of this laid out in front of me, and I told him I wanted to move forward. Not out of anger, out of clarity. By the end of November, my estate was in an irrevocable trust. The house was not listed for sale, but I had made my own decision about what to do with it. A decision I hadn't shared with anyone except Patricia, Renee, and James Whitfield. My updated will reflected my actual wishes, not the ones that had existed on paper since 2018. I also, in this part I want you to understand was the most important piece. I had documentation showing that every decision I made during this period was made after independent legal consultation. Every single one. Signed, dated, witnessed. James Whitfield's idea. He said, "If anyone ever tries to argue you weren't of sound mind, this buries that argument before it starts." I took his advice. Thanksgiving has always been my holiday. Joanne started it when Daniel and Renee were small, and after she passed, I kept doing it because it was the one tradition that made the house feel like a house instead of just a building I lived in. Every year, turkey, sweet potatoes, the green bean casserole that nobody loves but everyone eats, the particular smell of the oven running for 6 hours. This year, Renee flew in from Portland. She knew most of what had happened. I'd called her during the process and told her everything, which she deserved. She was angrier than I was, honestly. I had to talk her down more than once. Daniel and Claire came with the grandkids. I wanted them there. That part I want to be clear about. Whatever was happening between Daniel and me, those children had nothing to do with it, and I was not going to let the adults' mess reach them. Patricia drove down from Asheville and arrived the night before. She helped me prep the turkey. We talked about old colleagues in the school where we'd both worked for so long and how strange it is to drive past a place you spent decades inside and feel both everything and nothing simultaneously. Dinner itself was the kind of careful, watchful thing you've probably experienced in your own family at one point or another. Conversations that stayed in safe lanes. Daniel was charming with the kids. Claire mentioned twice that the food was wonderful. Renee kept her eyes on me with an expression I recognized. It's the same one she wore the whole week before Joanne died. Vigilant. Ready. After the kids finished and went to the living room to watch a movie, the table got quieter. Patricia refilled her wine. Renee put her fork down. Daniel was the one who finally stepped toward whatever he'd been moving toward all evening. "Dad," he said, "I know last month didn't go the way any of us hoped." He paused. "I want you to know that everything I've been doing has been about making sure you're taken care of." I looked at him across the table. "I found out," he continued, "that you've been working with an attorney, which is great, honestly. That's exactly what you should be doing." He said it the way you compliment a child for doing the thing you were about to suggest they do. I'd just like to be part of that process, to understand what's been decided, so I can be there for you. Renee put her hand flat on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a stillness. I took a sip of water. "There are a few things I want to share," I said. Daniel nodded, relieved. He thought I was opening a door. "I've moved my estate into an irrevocable trust." The word irrevocable landed the way I suspected it might. Daniel's expression didn't collapse, he's too careful for that, but something in it adjusted, like a compass recalculating. "That means," I continued, "that the house, the accounts, the pension disposition, none of that can be restructured based on someone's assessment of my mental capacity. It's already been managed, legally, permanently." Claire set down her wine glass. I kept going, not to hurt him, but because the truth doesn't get easier if you soften it at the edges. "I also want you to know that I spoke to Sandra Pruitt. She told me about your conversation with her, about my supposed memory problems, about the appointments I'd missed." I watched him. "Daniel, I haven't missed a single appointment this year." The silence that followed was the particular kind that happens when a room full of people all understand something at the same time. Daniel opened his mouth. Then he did something I didn't expect. He closed it. He looked down at the table. Something moved across his face, not the strategy, Not the careful version of himself, something underneath that. Something that looked like a person who had gotten very far down a road and only just now looked up at the signs. Claire reached for his hand. He didn't take it. "I should have talked to you," he said finally. "Yes," I said. "You should have." I panicked. He looked up at me, and for the first time in a long time, I could see my kid in there, not the adult who decided I was an asset to be managed. They've been harder than I let on. And I started thinking about what happens. When you're older, when it gets more complicated. "Daniel," I said, "I'm 71. I'm not incapacitated. I am your father. And my future is mine to manage." Renee was very still. Patricia looked at her wineglass. Daniel nodded, slowly. "The way you nod when you can't argue with something and you know it?" Then Claire said, and I think she genuinely meant it as a practical question, not as what it sounded like. "But what about the house? What happens to it eventually?" The table went completely quiet. Daniel looked at his wife with an expression I'll remember for the rest of my life. "Claire," he said. But the question was already out there. I looked at Claire for a moment. She seemed to realize a beat too late what the question had revealed. I said, "The house will eventually support a scholarship fund through the school district where I taught. James Whitfield has already filed the framework." Nobody spoke. Outside, from the living room, came the distant sound of the grandkids arguing about which movie to watch next. Daniel put both hands on the table and looked at them. His knuckles were white. He didn't leave. That's the thing I want to say. He didn't grab his coat and storm out. He sat there for a long time without speaking. And I think the thing he was doing, the thing that was costing him a great deal, was deciding what kind of man he was going to be in the next few minutes. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry, Dad. Not for the documents, not for the attorney, for what came before all of that, for the 2 years of questions that circled and circled without ever landing on the truth." I didn't tell him it was fine, it wasn't fine, but I told him I heard him. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quiet. Renee flew back to Portland and called me that Sunday and every Sunday since. Patricia drove back to Asheville and texted me a picture of her cat sitting on my guest pillow, which she titled Evidence. Life at 71 is not dramatic. I want to say that plainly. Most mornings I drink coffee on my back porch and watch the yard that Joanne used to garden, and I think about what I want to do with the next portion of my time here. I started consulting 2 afternoons a week at a local high school, working with the social studies department. The young teacher running the department is 28 years old and has more energy than anyone I've known since I was her age. I like watching her work. It reminds me of why I got into teaching in the first place, which had nothing to do with a pension. Daniel called me in early January. Not about the trust, not about the house, just to talk. We covered the holidays, the kids' school stuff, a piece of local news he thought I'd find interesting. Toward the end of the call, he said, "I'm looking at some options, cleaning some things up financially." Renee gave me the name of a counselor she knows. I didn't say anything for a moment. "That's a good step," I said. "Yeah." A pause. I should have taken it a long time ago. We talked for another 20 minutes about a documentary he'd watched, about whether this year's crop of college football teams was actually interesting or just seemed that way, about nothing important and everything that mattered. When we hung up, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while. I still love my son. I want that to be clear. I never stopped, not for one day of this whole ordeal. And I think anyone who's had a child and then watched that child become someone complicated knows that love doesn't come with an off switch. It doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always protect you, but it doesn't go away either. What changed is that I stopped needing his approval to make decisions about my own life. That's a smaller shift than it sounds, and a bigger one than I can fully explain. For most of my adult years, I made choices with at least one eye on how the people I loved would receive them. Joanne, the kids, the job. I'm not saying that's wrong, that's what family means. You factor each other in. But there comes a point when factoring someone in becomes letting them decide, and those are not the same thing. If you're in a position anything like mine, if you've noticed the questions starting, if someone in your family has begun circling your finances like they're looking for a gate, I want to say this to you as plainly as I can. Go see an elder law attorney. Not next month, this week. Get your power of attorney in order and name someone you trust completely. Document your decision-making. Not because you're confused, because you're not, and you deserve proof of that on record. You are allowed to love your children and protect yourself at the same time. Those two things do not cancel each other out. In fact, I'd argue that protecting yourself is one of the most honest things you can do for the people who love you, because it refuses to let money become the center of the relationship. My name is Kowalski. I taught 38 years of history, which means I spent my career explaining to young people that the past has consequences, that decisions made quietly in one room eventually echo loudly in another, and that dignity is not something that gets handed to you. It's something you hold on to. I'm still holding on. Protecting yourself isn't a betrayal of the people you love, it's an act of self-respect that keeps love honest. Ray didn't cut his son out of his life. He simply refused to disappear from his own. When you hold your ground with quiet dignity, something surprising happens. The relationship gets a real chance to heal, because it's no longer built on what someone hopes to take from you, but on who you actually are to each other. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of meaningful entertainment while carrying a positive lesson about love, boundaries, and the quiet courage it takes to protect your own life.